Yeah. Welcome everyone to the pod. Thanks for coming back and diving in with us. Um, so today we have with us Rahul Deedwania. You'll hear us refer to him lovingly as Deeds. Um, Rahul started off his career in management consulting and then transitioned to work in strategy and finance at YouTube and Google. And this is when he first started learning about coaching and heavily considered going into executive coaching and team coaching um, for the long term. He was drawn to it, um, the personal growth and self emergence that he saw possible there primarily. And instead the universe pushed him in a different direction, and he decided to start Breakout IQ, a company focused on building team rapport through escape rooms. And I can attest to this. It was a hugely positive force during the COVID-19 pandemic when no one could really see each other. And so they pivoted to some really cool online versions of this. After selling that business in 2021, he decided to pursue a longtime passion for helping others as a life and executive coach. And at the end of 2021, he transitioned almost entirely to working in leadership development, team facilitation, and executive coaching. He also started a podcast, Woven Wings, which partially inspired us to start this conversation where he focuses on spirituality and personal growth. And with that, let's dive right in with Rahul Deedwania, or Deeds.
Thanks for
How's
having
it?
me.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe for those who don't know, what is coaching? And maybe in your own words, and share a little bit about, I gave you a little brief there, but share a little bit about what got you so excited about it.
Yeah, it's funny. You'd think I'd have an answer to that question on speed dial, but it's defined in so many different ways. I think very simply, the way I think about coaching is it's being a partner with somebody in figuring out where they want to go and how to get there, right? And that's very simple definition. And I think that can apply in a lot of different arenas. When we talk about executive coaching, it's where does somebody want to be as a leader? How do they want to develop? What are their blind spots? How do you work through that? How do you navigate your whole person? Because even if you're a leader, you're a person in all these other capacities. How do you work through those things and find your kind of the things that make you special, and get you to where you want to get to? Or life coaching, right? It can be, hey, I want to change careers. I want to have a more fulfilling family life. I want to change my relationship with money. I want to reevaluate the balance and everything in my life. Health and wellness coaching, right? I want to lose weight. I want to feel more healthy. And so there are so many different arenas, but I think very generally, it's really about bringing more light, bringing more power, fulfillment, joy into life. And so I think in terms of why I've been drawn to it, it was one of those things that when I learned that this is something you could do professionally, I was like, oh, whoa, like that's the thing I love doing any time of day with anybody. I look back to childhood, high school, college. That was the thing I would avoid studying, working, to do, right? It's like someone's like, hey, I'm trying to figure out this thing. I don't know if I should, apply for this role in my club, try to become a leader, or hey, I'm really struggling with this conflict in our friend group. I'm like, I'm there. That's the thing that I like was always drawn to. And so it was just this moment of realization that, hey, maybe there's a way to bring that natural draw to something that is actually apparently a professional field. So that was my initial
So
hook.
one thing that makes me curious about some of the background that we just talked about is it sounds like you had your first exposure to it when you were at either YouTube or Google in the early days of your career. What was that, and what, you just mentioned it earlier as well, like you're like, oh, you can actually do this as a profession. Um, what was it that kind of what was your initial exposure to it, and what made you realize that it's something you wanted to take on, like as your primary profession?
Yeah, so it was just a friend of a friend, or I was talking to somebody, and they had a friend who was just going around like basically getting practice conversations in. So this is somebody else training to be a coach, and I was just like, hey, I'll be a guinea pig for that. Sure, why not? And at that time I was also starting to debate like, hey, what do I want to do after Google? And the kind of the primary pie in the sky that I had in my mind was starting a company. That's something all of us have talked about many times over the years. And I was like, yeah, like, it's been lingering in my field for a long time. I think I want to explore it. And so I viewed that conversation with this student coach as, hey, maybe I'll get even a little bit of clarity for myself and also have an interesting conversation. And then in having that conversation, I was like, whoa, this is a thing. And then I learned about it. I started just talking about it more generally. And as often as the case, when you start putting something out there, a lot of things start coming back. And suddenly, like many people I knew either were working with coaches or knew other coaches. I had a few more chats. And then it kind of created this fork in the road. I was like, hey, do I actually pursue this thing? Or do I follow this earlier itch of starting a company? And I ended up deciding like, hey, I want to go down that road instead. But it was just around that time that I learned about it. And I think that interest never went away, right? It was still there even 6 years later after we sold our company. And I was like, okay, that it's persisted, that it's, if anything, even stronger. I worked with a coach for the first time in 2021. And so being on the other end of that, I was just like, oh, this is such a great partnership. I'd love to explore it further.
Yeah, one thing is when we were growing up, I feel like the main thing that existed in the world was therapy more than coaching. And it was often seen that you'd go to therapy if like something was wrong, distinctly wrong. Like you could identify, I need to go to therapy because XYZ. And I feel like in working with you too as a coach, we worked a little bit together. I kind of learned some of the differences between thinking about coaching and thinking about therapy, but also that both have been destigmatized, I think has been really a good development. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about how did you think a little about the difference? Like, did you want to be a coach? Did you want to be a therapist? How do you view the difference between those two things? And then do you feel like it's evolved? Like, do you feel like there's more openness now? People are more introspective? Like, what's changed in a way for this to become, I think, a pretty booming field if we start to look at how many people are now interested in either being coaches or getting coached?
Yeah, starting with your first question, there's a place for both modalities. Very simply, therapy, and this is a little reductive for both sides, but therapy tends to focus on healing. So looking into your past, unpacking things that have developed as patterns, storylines, neurological conditioning, just emotional conditioning, and helping you understand that and find a sense of, I'd say, like agency and and control, or at least understanding and acceptance around those parts of yourself. And so it tends to be a little bit more retrospective, and coaching tends to be a little bit more forward looking. And so it's taking as an assumption, like, hey, where you are right now is great. Let's now look ahead and help you envision, hey, where do you want to be? Right. And use kind of that as a roadmap. And so each one has its place. And often you'll encounter people, myself included, who actually work with both. So I'm working with a therapist and I'm also working with a coach. And there are blurred lines, I think in terms of the approach that a coach and a therapist might use, even the topics or the insights that you might glean, they might be similar in nature, but then there are additional bells and whistles that a therapist will use versus a coach, and vice versa, that will take you in slightly different directions, right? So that's just a little bit around that. But in terms of what you're saying, are like definitely it is different now than even when we were growing up, from an industry perspective. Way less stigma, way more acceptance. There's still stigma in a lot of places, but I think both therapy and coaching, and just this topic of mindset, of mental health, has really, really, really taken hold, I think, more broadly. As it relates to coaching specifically, I think there are a few things happening in the industry that are really interesting. One is because coaching has gotten more destigmatized, I think tons and tons of coaches are flooding into the market. And so on the supply side, way more coaches are being minted, and that's happening, every day. And then the demand side keeps growing because I think what people realized as work becomes more and more white collar, and at least in the world that we live in, right? And it's much more about knowledge, much less about widgets, much more about working together, much more about managing complexity, right? As technology takes a lot of the base work away, it's become more and more important to invest in that part of the stack, right? Which is mindset, confidence, collaboration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the next wave that we're seeing is as AI comes on and takes a lot of the kind of the rote parts of coaching, like just around asking questions, knowledge sharing. You can now go on and talk to Chat GPT about your leadership challenges, and it'll give you tons of content, right? And so what's happening now is coaching is exploring a model in which it partners with AI, right? Where AI takes parts of it, but there's still a place for coaching, which is really around the human side, right? And the human side of growth, of development, of leadership, of again that term I always use around self-emergence, right? Becoming the best version of yourself. And so it's really interesting. There's a lot happening in the space right now.
I mean, that's just real quick. That's fascinating to me that you feel like there is an embrace between the two, that it's not conflicting. Like I could talk to an AI for some portion of a coaching conversation, and you would feel like that's synergistic with a broader coaching conversation. Is it something about coaching that's like saying something out loud, outside of your head, getting it out of your mind and onto paper that's really powerful? Is that why that's also helpful? Or is it beyond that, that there's just some simple questions that you'll always ask someone, but it's like you need to take those answers and go deeper, and that's how they work together?
Yeah, I guess I should say, like, as with everything that AI or maybe more broadly technology touches, there's a disruptive component to it that's not synergistic and that's very threatening. A lot of coaches are like, oh man, like if Arv can just go talk to Chat GPT, like why would he talk to me? And then there's a more visionary kind of approach to looking at it, which is, hey, how can we actually pair the two, right? And so one of the challenges with coaching is that it's expensive, and accessibility has been a conversation in both therapy and coaching circles for a very long time. And so what you can do with AI is you can scale a lot of the base components of coaching, and I'll speak to that in a minute, and then still have something over the top. And this is all very, very early, right? No one has cracked the code yet on what exactly this is going to look like. But to get to what you were saying, Arvin, this will maybe talk a little bit more about what coaching can be in practice, at least the way I describe it. To me, there are like 4 or 5 different things that coaching is valuable for. The first, and I may have even used this when you and we talked way back when, Arv, is just showing up for yourself, going into a room, an empty room, and there's a rock there, and you go and you just talk to that rock at a set time every week, and you just offload what's on your mind. You hear yourself, right? Again, the rock's not saying anything back to you. You just hear it. That is immensely valuable. That is immensely valuable unto itself, right? And just having that structure in which to do that can be, oftentimes that is the entire value that somebody will get out of coaching. The next
It's
step,
funny. It's funny.
yeah,
It's funny you mentioned that, because I think that's like when someone says they're my rock,
yeah,
like that's kind of what it is.
yeah,
Like if
yeah.
someone is your rock, it's like someone who you can talk to and say anything to and open up to and kind of like let loose with.
Yeah. There's that safety component, right? And that stability component that defines what it means to be a rock. And so this idea that, hey, you can go somewhere and just be yourself fully, right? Which is hard to do, like a lot of times why people seek out coaches or therapists is, as much as we idealize having that type of relationship with our friends, like between us, even with our partners, the closest people in our lives, sometimes you don't feel that, right? Or there might be something that you're holding back, because there are implications to being 100% transparent, right? And so that's one of the benefits is, hey, you can go into this room, talk to a rock, do it every week, every 2 weeks, and that's powerful, right? The second step is, now imagine it's not a rock, but it's a mirror, and the mirror is selectively reflecting back the most important things that you're saying. And so now there's this interpretive layer that's also introduced, right? And that kind of takes it to the next level, right? Say, hey, I hear this is what you're saying. Like, oh yeah, that is what I'm saying. Oh, hey, when you said that, you got really excited. When you said that, you suddenly got really low. Oh, interesting. Okay, what does that mean for how I relate to this thing I'm talking about? And so that has a lot of power in and of itself. And again, that's a place where, I mean, the tonality, energy part of it, AI is not yet able to answer, right? But hey, can I ask questions? Can I say things? Can it play things back, right? You could have that conversation with ChatGPT. Now imagine it's on a rock, it's on a mirror, but it's something that can now inquire back. And so I'm coming in, I'm saying a bunch of things, this thing is reflecting it back to me, right? But now not only is it reflecting back, but I'm being asked questions that are going to widen my aperture, or I'm being asked questions that are going to narrow my focus, right? And bring something that's very vague into focus. And so that's kind of the third layer, is something that's not just giving you space, not just reflecting back, but also changing the way you think about something, or inspiring you to think about something in a broader way. And then the fourth and fifth buckets, very, very quickly. The fourth one I always talk about is challenging. So someone that will keep you honest, right? Look for consistency or inconsistency, or call out when you're telling yourself a story, and telling the coach a story that's not consistent with other things that you've said, or not aligned with the values that you've uncovered with your coach. And then the fifth one, and arguably the most important, is championing, right? So a place where a coach is going to come to you and just ooze this energy of support, ooze this energy of seeing you in your best light, even when you don't, right? And that has this like sort of alchemical effect that is really hard to describe, right? When you feel like, oh wow, this person sees me that way, like I am that way, and then you start to actualize that in the way you go through your life. So that was a lot. I'll pause there.
No, that's awesome. I think it's like a really, maybe you should have started with that one first, because that one's really good.
I mean, Deeds, one
Um,
thing, just to what you just said, I experienced that personally when talking to you, because I would be telling you, hey, like, I don't think that I'm not the kind of person who starts anything. I always think of something and then I kind of quit it. I go, 30% in and then it ends up dropping. And you were like, I don't think that's consistent with everything that you've told me before, with everything that you've started before. But B, if I'm reflecting on my relationship with you and everything we've talked about, like that's 100% not true. Even if you just look at starting coaching, right? Like that impetus
Yeah.
to go talk to you even. And you were able to reflect back to me really quickly, like, here's all the ways in what you're saying actually isn't the right, not the right story, but isn't consistent with the story that you're now saying out loud. And that was really empowering to me to hear that reflected back to me in a way that was like, hey, you don't need to be going down this negative storyline, especially when that's not necessarily consistent with reality. And so I felt like that was like that level 4 or 5, everything you just talked about, it
Yeah.
made sense to me, and how our conversations used to go. It was like you would be operating that reflective level until you saw something where you would call out that wasn't where maybe the consistency was at. And then you'd have that chance to inspire that growth. So very
Yeah, and
accurate, I would
there's
say.
building on that, Arv, there's like this framework that Tony Robbins, the coach that anyone that doesn't know about coaching still knows about, the Michael Jordan of coaching. He popularized this concept of state, story, and solution. And I'll explain what that means in a second. State, story, and solution. And so the idea is you're faced by a situation, and our default tendency is to go to solution, right? I'm having some sort of a problem. Let me try to figure out what to do about it, or solution, or you might even call it strategy, right? So straight, story, strategy. And so we immediately jump to like, how do I solve this problem? How do I solve this problem? And underlying that are these two things, which is, what is the story that you're carrying into that strategy? And what is the state you're in to arrive at that story that carries you into that strategy? And so just to take your example, Arv, if you want to start something, you can go down the road and be like, okay, what are all the tactics? I need to do this. I need to do this. I need to do this. But underlying that, if you have this story that, hey, I'm not someone who starts something, right? Or I'm someone that might start something, but I stop when it gets hard, right? That was the narrative that we uncovered when you and I were working together. And so if that's the narrative you're operating from, that's the narrative that's going to play out, right? You're going to start something and it's going to get hard and you're going to stop. And so how do you instead go a layer deeper and look at that story? Now, the way you look at your stories is going to be impacted by your state. And what that means is if you're in a stressed place or you're in low energy, you're physically tired, you have a lot of conflict in your life, anything that's bringing you what we'll call below the line, you're going to have a very narrow view of what's possible. And your stories are going to reflect that, right? Your stories are going to put you in a victim place. Oh, I don't have time. I'm too busy. There are too many things going on. Oh yeah, these are all the reasons I don't, uh, what's it called? I don't overcome something when it gets hard. And you'll find all the evidence that supports that story. And that's all you're going to be fixated on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, instead, if you, go play basketball, you've had a really good day, you've hung out with the homies, you're feeling really good, you have a great dinner with Anjali, you hang out with Kuvi, you hang out with Gia and Ranj and Arya, right? You're super pumped and you're feeling good about life. Suddenly you're going to look at it as, hey, yeah, there were these times I didn't get over the hard point, but hey, like, what does that say about where I'm going to go next? Nothing, right? Actually, I got to that 30%. This time I'm going to get to 50, right? And your mindset, it feels almost like hypnosis, right? You can literally just change the way you're relating to the exact same set of facts. And then suddenly now your strategies are going to reflect all of those different stories, and your strategies are going to be much more empowered. And so a lot of coaching is coming in at that state and story level and helping you find the state and the stories that are empowering, and then from that place coming up with strategies versus just going straight to the strategies.
So this actually, this analogy really resonates with me quite a bit. And in my life, my primary like occupation is I'm in sales. And one thing that often happens in my line of work is that you'll get an adversarial email or have an adversarial conversation with someone who's a customer or a potential customer. And so many times in my life, especially earlier on in my career, the thing I would jump to is, okay, how do I solve this problem, or how do I make them feel better about what's happening, or something like that. And often by trying to respond quickly and jump to a conclusion or jump into a solution, it would have a negative effect. Whereas by letting it simmer and letting it wait, not only do you allow the person on the other side to calm down and not react in a way that's emotional and angry or adversarial, you also allow yourself to come down from a place of stress and feeling like you're in a corner. And it allows you to bring a lot more, the strategy you use actually tends to be better and have a better outcome. And that's happened to me time and time again. And so like what you just talked about in that framework actually really, really resonates with me.
Yeah, it's really, really powerful, and there are all these parallels to that way of thinking in our spiritual traditions. It's rooted Buddhism is sort of having a reawakening, right? And especially in the circles that we roll in the tech world and the kind of so-called self-realized or conscious philosophers, all these people that are emerging. And there's a reason for that, right? Because it actually also leads to better outcomes in addition to deeper fulfillment. And it starts by managing state, right? And there's so many different ways you can do that. But if you're able to manage state, you tend to strategize better. And it's very reinforcing once you get into that loop.
One thing we were both thinking about is just to transition slightly, but a little bit into business model around coaching. How do you see, some of the coaching businesses evolving over time from, I think you're in a company where there's a couple people, you're doing executive coaching. There's like a really, really well-experienced senior leader in your company who's gone through it for years. Maybe you could talk a little about that and how that model works out. Or do you see some companies kind of turning into really big, huge, almost coaching farms where you're going to have hundreds of coaches within a single organization? Or does it become individual, like everyone's an individual player in the space, and that's really how the game's going to evolve? What do you think is happening there?
It's a really good question. I haven't really thought about where it's going to go in a lot of depth, but I'm I'll try to talk it out loud with you all. I can at least start with where it is now, right? Where it is now is it's very fragmented. So the thing that got really popular over the last few years is there are a couple of these platforms. There's this organization called BetterUp. There's another one called Torch. There are a couple other ones that are forming, but those are the two really big ones. And they're essentially coaching marketplaces, right? And so organization like, say, a Google can sign up with BetterUp. BetterUp will plug in, they have their tech-enabled platform and help essentially match people with coaches. And that's now a benefit, right? That's a benefit that Google will offer some number of its employees, or at least its leaders, and they can go on, they can find their coach, and then eventually that still ends up being a one-to-one coaching relationship, but it's facilitated through this platform. Each coach is an independent entity. BetterUp is not training them. BetterUp doesn't employ them. They're all contractors. So it's a marketplace. So that's been one of the big scaling agents. On the coaching side, I mean, you can maybe kind of draw an analogy to like an Uber and Lyft. On the coaching side, coaches complain about, low play, unpredictable deal flow, all the stuff you might expect. On the client side, this is purely anecdotal, but on the client side, I think you get variable experiences. But that's always going to be true with coaches and therapists. You have to find sort of the right fit, and that can take time. So that's one thing that's taken off, right? Is this marketplace sort of approach. The other thing I mentioned earlier, this like AI enabled. I'm not directly familiar with the offerings that are being developed in that arena, but I'm increasingly hearing more and more about this. That like, AI enabled coaching, and you actually have sort of a front end where you're interacting with AI. Or what Torch did. Torch's thing was pairing knowledge or knowledge acquisition, or I'll say like training with coaching. So you go into Torch, like, hey, I'm a new manager. I need to learn how to delegate. I need to learn how to set expectations. They have a course, and then they'll have a coach that is also there and supports you. So it's kind of taking some of the BetterUp marketplace type stuff, but layering in training. And so that's another model that we see. And then there are tons and tons of individual coaches sprinkled around, right? So for me, for example, it's myself. It's just my mentor, my boss, my partner, Jocelyn Kung. It's the two of us, right? And we go in and we work with people, with teams, with organizations. Our work, and this will speak to another part of the coaching field, at least when it comes to businesses. Our work is coaching is sort of the minority part of what we do, right? And coaching has all this overlap in the business context with consulting, with training, with team development, leadership development, organizational development, and design consulting. So there are all these different things that are all on the kind of the people side of the house, which start to overlap or potentially get bundled. And so that's just another model, which is, hey, we'll be your one-stop shop to help you solve some of your business problems, your team development problems, but also come in and coach, individuals, come in and train, larger parts of your organization. So that's a whole other model. So I think what you'll find is that it's super, super fragmented. I think over time, what I slowly am starting to anticipate is I think there will be a like high-end coaching model, which will still remain kind of one-to-one, stay pretty expensive, typically be for more senior executives where you can unlock budget, much more easily. There will be a marketplace model for kind of mid-tier managers, at least at bigger companies. So the BetterUps, the Torches of the world. And then there will be a scaled AI-enabled model for anybody that wants to get access to some version of coaching support. That's my current outlook, but we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, that's actually super interesting. And where do you see yourself? Like, if that were the future, where would you land? Probably on the executive high end Lamborghini.
That would be
coach.
the hope. That would be the hope. That's currently where I live. I don't know where that or how that layer will get impacted. The other thing within that layer, that kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, is I do think some of the it's possible within that layer, there are a lot of different ways that people work with these senior executives, and I think parts of it will get siphoned off by AI enabled tools, and parts of it will continue to remain in the hands of coaches. And what I hope to do, I'm personally most interested in the things that get leaders to reflect on who they are as people. What are all the things that flow into who they are as people, and how does that impact the way that they lead their organizations? And that type of stuff, I don't see that moving out of coaching for a very long time. In fact, I think that's still pretty early, and a lot of interest is continuing to pour in. A lot of new innovations from a process and philosophy standpoint are continuing to develop. So that's where I hope to play.
Well, let me be more direct. Will there be a Deeds GPT?
We'll see. I don't know. I not on my roadmap right now. But one of the other things, actually, Vivek, that you and I have talked about before, and I know you've thought about this as you've experimented with consulting this year. The downside of the direct service model, right, is that you're limited by your time, and I think that then opens
Scales
up
linearly.
It scales linearly, and then the question becomes like, hey, how do you scale exponentially, or how do you get leverage? And I think the most common route that you'll see from coaches that have done really well is content, right? Like media content. You write a book, you do talks, you create a course. A lot of people can take the course, right? That's the most common way to get out of the linear scaling. But who knows? Maybe a GPT will be another way to do it.
You heard it here first, folks.
I mean, I find it one thing is interesting on the financial side for me is like in philosophy, I think they talk a lot about a gaining idea, like something you do something to gain something else, and I think if you look at a meditative kind of practice, you don't want to go in necessarily with a gaining idea. But one thing that's hard about coaching is you're trying to sell something to someone. They're going to try to pay you physical dollars, but it's hard to say this is the ROI for this investment, right? So you almost have to pair the success of being a more emotionally in tune with yourself person, being someone who's going to be able to make better decisions, like all of that benefit that you get on the other side of coaching, with the input of saying, I'm going to have to pay X amount of money up front to make this happen, which is just an interesting thing. I mean, I feel like we live in the Bay Area, this ethos around sort of self-reflection and how that can contribute to better decision making, I feel like is more established. But I wonder if in larger corporate America, if people would look at a line item like, I'm going to sell you an executive coaching service, if that sort of butts up against, well, what do I get back? Like, is that going to pay me back at all or what? And then it just gets down voted in the budget line item until it's not there anymore. Like, how do you think about that balance?
I think what you point to is a very real thing. I think kind of like any market, like if you think about coaching, it's still relatively young as a space. I mean, the earliest coaches have been around for, I don't know, probably 40, 50 years. But I think what we were talking about earlier, right? Coaching becoming more and more mainstream. There's a level of just like market development or market education that's very much underway, right? And so when I think about what I'm trying to do, I'm like, hey, where do I want to try to find my next opportunity? It's not going to be to try to convert the skeptic, right? Who's like completely not bought in at all, that has no frame of reference for coaching. It's more likely going to be, hey, let me find the people that I've worked with that know people who they could tell, they're like, hey, I benefited from this. You should check it out. And they already have some degree of openness to it. Maybe they're a little bit skeptical, but they're not fully skeptical. And it's a much more natural entry point. And I think over time, the market will continue to just grow, given how much more mainstream it's becoming.
Yeah, so I guess it's a good place to kind of transition, maybe, which is we know that you do a podcast. So I guess what made you want to start a podcast, and how has your learning experience been doing it?
Yeah. I mean, Very similar. I was sharing with both of you over the weekend. It was so fun in the first couple episodes in particular, just to hear the two of you reflecting out loud, like what the early experience of starting the podcast has been for you, right? Just that you're like, oh, I'm feeling creative. I'm like, oh, I had this hesitation. I'm on the other side of this hesitation. Hey, like we listen to a lot of things, but we have things to say. Oh, we're forming and advancing our own learning as we, say things out loud. Those are a lot of the same reasons that I started a podcast, and it's been almost 3 years, for our podcast. But that same year is when I transitioned into coaching, started the podcast, started writing. That's sort of fallen off, but it was all part of this. And Arv, you and I talked about this, right? Like first time I wrote something and sent it out, goes out to a few hundred people. There was this feeling of like, oh my God, like that's out there now, and I think just cultivating that identity of like, hey, I can create, or I am a creator. That was a lot of it, right? And then I think the part that's kept the podcast going is just that these conversations are super energizing, right? I can already anticipate for myself when we hang up, I'm going to be buzzing, right? Because it's just fun. It's just fun to have these kinds of conversations, and we learn, right? For the two of you, you're asking all these questions about the coaching industry. You would probably never have thought about that earlier when you talked to Pavan talking about urban air mobility, right? And so I think just the podcast being a medium for learning as well as for connection, those two things, continue to make it interesting. And so, yeah, I love that you're doing it. And I love that you found that early positive feedback just in terms of the energy that you're feeling around it.
What challenges have you had? How have you kept it going? I mean, it's been 3 years, but you still do it. And also for those listening, it's called Woven Wings, right?
Yeah. Main challenge, I would say. So a couple of things. One is less of a challenge, but more a design principle. And I alluded to this with you too over the weekend. I think minimizing the friction to recording and to publishing is super important. And we, over time, started adding processes, some of which made things more efficient, some of which kind of added a little bit of weight to the process. And recently we've been feeling a little bit of like, kind of a dip in our own energy around the project. And we're like, hey, we need to trim even more of this stuff that's adding friction. And then one of the specific subsets of that is maintaining guest flow. That can sometimes be challenging. We generally didn't have a problem with that, but sometimes we would, and we'd be like, all right, we need to like scramble to find somebody. And for our show for a long time, we always had a guest. And so you two also have the option, at least the way you've kicked it off so far, to just talk to each other. And right. Gabe, my co-host, and I, we would periodically dip into that well. And then sometimes like, hey, why don't we just always be able to fall back on this? And that kind of reduced some of that friction as well, so that we're not feeling stressed around it. But the main thing to directly answer your question, Vivek, the main challenge has been that because it's been something of an extracurricular for us, we haven't succeeded in like growing an audience. And I think it's gotten to a point now where between each of our own individual paths and other things emerging in our fields, and then not having the external energy of like a growing audience or an engaged audience that's like keeping you like committed to the project, we've started to feel a little bit of that dip where we're like, hey, if it's not growing for a long time, like that doesn't matter. We get enough out of the learning, out of the connection. We love just putting something out there. We always refer to it for ourselves as a spiritual practice of our own because we get so much out of it. But we're like, oh, without that growth, over time, you might find that that energy starts to dissipate. Once the novelty energy leaves, you want to continue to tap into, hey, why is this interesting to me still? And so that's just been an ongoing journey. And no matter what, we're happy with where it's gotten to. But recently, we're like, hey, there's a non-zero chance that it's run its course. And that can be hard to stomach, but also not not a bad place to be, probably.
Yeah I think I'm gonna circle us up, Deeds, but I want to say a couple reflections as we end here. One is when you started coaching with me, you said one thing to me, which was, it's nice to enter this conversation knowing this conversation is about you, and you don't have to reciprocally ask me questions. And I think, it's interesting because we're friends going into that conversation, always feeling like you ask me, hey, how are you doing? And me always feeling wanting to ask you back, oh, how are you doing? After I answer, you're like, no, this is your space. And one of the nice things about this podcast I found, and the way in which the conversation is different, is we get a chance to focus on what you're doing without you feeling like you have to ask us back, hey, what are you up to? So
Yeah.
that I feel like has created an interesting depth of conversation, and also something we wouldn't naturally have at a dinner party, because we would have those back and forths in a way that sort of sometimes can disrupt depth in the service of feeling equal in the conversational flow. And I wanted to say, thank you for starting Woven Wings in the way that it's caused us to feel like we could start this and give us that impetus, but also just feeling like we got a chance just now to talk to you in a depth that I don't think we ever would have understood coaching, ever have gotten into talking to you about that.
Yeah.
And really wanted to thank you for the time and just like letting us into that world in a way that we wouldn't have gotten in otherwise.
No, thank you both for creating this space, for having that curiosity, for asking great questions, for thinking of me, bringing me into the loop. It was a fun time.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. And anything else you want to say or share with whoever's listening, and otherwise we can wrap.
I'll just say again, I already said this, but I just want to encourage the two of you to keep following this spark. It's a great thing you've started here, and I love just the energy and the concept of let's dive right in, and also encourage the listeners that are listening to this to think about what is their thing that they can just get off the ground and dive right in.
I love
awesome.
It. All right.
All right.
Talk to you later, man. Bye.
Bye.